In 1944, an entire Japanese convoy vanished in the Western Pacific without a single distress call, no wreckage, no survivors. For decades, the United States Navy denied that anything unusual had occurred, but recently declassified patrol logs tell a different story, a story of something colossal moving through the deep, hunted by men who were ordered to pretend it never existed. It began with a whisper of sound in the headphones of a sonar operator aboard the American submarine USS Seadragon. The sea that night was black and calm, the air so still that every creak of metal echoed like thunder. Then came the pulse, faint, mechanical, steady, too deep for a freighter, too large for any known submarine. The captain listened, his eyes narrowing as the rhythm shifted, echoing through the hull like a heartbeat. They followed the contact for 20 minutes before it vanished into static. The log entry read simply, unidentified, possibly enemy sub. What they had heard was the first trace of Japan's Phantom Fleet, a secret arm of the Imperial Navy known only to a handful of officers in Tokyo. These were the I-boats, monstrous underwater vessels longer than destroyers, built not just to attack, but to carry cargo, scientists, and weapons across entire oceans. Some could launch aircraft, others carried gold, blueprints, even vials of experimental agents bound for Germany. To Allied intelligence, they were myth. Rumors passed between codebreakers and radio operators, but to the men who glimpsed them on sonar, they were ghosts of steel. In Pearl Harbor, Admiral Charles Lockwood read the fragments of intercepts that hinted at their existence. Encrypted weather reports, sudden silences in shipping lanes, convoys disappearing without battle. He ordered a classified operation so secret it would never appear in wartime records. Operation Abyss. 3 American submarines were selected, Seadragon, Batfish, and Archerfish, each briefed in a sealed room where the maps were blank and the orders were whispered. Hunt, listen, report. No transmissions, no acknowledgement. The crews slipped into the Pacific like phantoms chasing phantoms. Days became weeks, measured only by diesel fumes and the hiss of oxygen scrubbers. Every echo was a question. Every shadow on the sonar screen felt like a trap. Somewhere beyond the Marianas, something vast was moving under the waves, something that carried the Empire's last secrets. The men could not see it, could not name it, but they could feel its presence. The deep rhythmic pulse of machinery in the dark. And as they pursued it into the black silence of the abyss, none of them knew that history would erase everything they were about to do. They were called the Hunters, though few of them ever saw the faces of those they pursued. Beneath the waves, the men of the silent service fought, in a world of heat, noise, and darkness, where a single mistake could turn steel into a coffin. Inside the narrow hull of the USS Seadragon, Lieutenant Commander Mark Hastings read and reread the orders stamped with a single word, Abyss. The page gave no location, no target, only a date and a bearing toward waters east of the Marianas. He had been at sea since 1942 and had seen things that would haunt him for the rest of his life. Torpedoes that failed to detonate, ships torn open, men clinging to oil-slicked water. Yet nothing in those years had prepared him for this mission. The sonar men whispered about it in mess, wondering what kind of ship could leave an echo that deep and that cold. Hastings told them nothing. The truth was that he did not know. At Pearl Harbor, Admiral Charles Lockwood and his intelligence chief, Captain Ned Beach, pieced together the puzzle that had drawn them into this shadow war. In the code room known as Hypo Annex, cryptanalysts hunched over intercepted messages from the Imperial Japanese Navy. Some were simple weather reports, others routine traffic between merchant convoys, but once in a while a fragment appeared that made no sense. Coordinates that pointed to empty ocean, or references to vessels with impossible tonnage. The Japanese called them I-class special operations boats. They were massive undersea carriers designed to cross the Pacific without surfacing, able to carry airplanes, mini-submarines, even secret passengers bound for German ports. Allied analysts had dismissed the early reports as exaggerations until the summer of 1943, when one such vessel, the I-52, was detected by a British long-range patrol and destroyed with all hands. Debris later recovered from the wreck proved the rumors true. Among the cargo were gold bullion, opium, and military blueprints sealed in lead containers. The shock inside naval intelligence was immediate. If one of these boats could reach Europe, it could bring with it weapons or knowledge capable of changing the balance of war. That realization created Operation Abyss, a mission so secret that even the men sailing it believed they were hunting ordinary freighters. Each commander received a sealed envelope, to be opened only after leaving port. Hastings opened his in the cramped control room, the diesel engines thrumming beneath his boots. Inside were 3 sentences. Proceed north to Grid Baker 7, intercept unknown contact, maintain radio silence, nothing more. He folded the paper and locked it in the safe. From that moment forward, Seadragon ceased to exist in official logs. The same day, 2 other submarines, Batfish and Archerfish, slipped out of Pearl under moonless skies. Each was crewed by 70 men who had spent so long underwater that the smell of fresh air already felt imaginary. They were trained killers, yes, but also mathematicians, mechanics, cooks, and fathers who carried photographs pressed against their hearts. Life aboard was a rhythm of routine and fear. 4 hours on watch, 8 hours off, if sleep came at all. The heat inside the control room often reached 120 degrees. Condensation dripped from the ceiling like rain. When the submarine dove deep, every man could feel the hull flex with a low groan that reminded them of the ocean's weight waiting to crush them. Yet discipline held them together. They trusted the instruments, the captain's calm, and the belief that their hunt had purpose. In Washington, analysts in the Office of Naval Intelligence studied the results of the first days of Operation Abyss. The radio silence was perfect. No contact, no confirmation, nothing but the faint background chatter of the Pacific. Then, on the 5th day, an intercepted Japanese transmission changed everything. It spoke of a rendezvous near the Caroline Islands involving Group 7, an unspecified unit escorted by destroyers. The message carried a new code word, Yamato Maru. No one in Allied command had ever heard it before. Lockwood ordered Hastings and the other commanders to converge without breaking silence. By the time Seadragon reached the area, the ocean had turned rough, storms churning the surface into gray mountains. Below, in the calm depths, the sonar room pulsed with tension. Every officer knew that if the contact they sought truly was one of the Imperial I-boats, it could dive deeper than they could follow. The crew listened for hours until, just before midnight, a faint echo returned. Steady, enormous, unmistakable. Hastings gave the order to track it. In the following moments, the air filled with the soft ticking of the sonar as it painted the unseen target. The helmsman whispered, "It's moving slow, sir. Too slow for a destroyer." The captain nodded, understanding what that meant. Somewhere in the dark, one of Japan's ghost ships was crawling through the abyss, unaware that 3 American submarines were closing in. No man spoke. They could feel the ocean's pressure around them, like a held breath. Above them, lightning flashed across the waves. Below, they advanced through silence toward a legend. The hunt. They found it again just after midnight, a slow iron heart beating somewhere ahead of the bow, so deep that even the ocean's own sounds seemed to thin out and step aside. Lieutenant Commander Mark Hastings stood over the plot table with his shoulders squared and his jaw tight, guiding Seadragon by voice more than by compass, drifting into the target's wake like a shadow learning how to become darker. The sonar operator counted the pulses under his breath, each murmur a footstep on a staircase that descended into nothing. The contact speed was wrong for a freighter, wrong for a destroyer, wrong for anything that belonged to the realm of surface ships. It crawled like a Leviathan conserving breath. Hastings signaled a turn, then another, sketching an invisible triangle in the black to fix range and course. He could feel the boat responding, a living thing under his hands, the hull giving that familiar low moan as depth crept closer, and the sea pressed in like a secret. In the control room, men spoke in syllables and nods. The helmsman's knuckles were pale on the wheel. The exec watched the ticking hands of the clock that every submariner learns to hear even when it is silent. The order came soft, make tubes 1 through 4 ready. The torpedo men slid the doors with care, metal kissing metal. The boat steadied. The ocean steadied. The contact grew. Then the voice from sonar, a whisper sharpened to a blade, said, "Bearing constant." Everyone felt the spark that jumps a crew at the moment. Math becomes destiny. Hastings breathed once, twice, and gave the firing solution. The torpedo data computer hummed as if it had a soul. "Open outer doors," he said. The boat shivered from bow to stern as cold water touched steel, and the sea learned there were fangs hidden here. Fire 1, a soft cough, a tremor. Fire 2, another. Fire 3, fire 4. The eels ran true, and Seadragon dipped her nose as if to see where her children were going. They waited. Waiting is a talent learned in terror. Somewhere far ahead, the clock inside the ocean counted down on their behalf, and each man imagined the hot needle of a detonator pricking the skin of an enemy hull. Then a bloom of thunder arrived late and enormous, a sound that rolled along the spine and set off small storms in every rib. The first detonation was close, the second wider, the third a gut punch, the fourth a question mark swallowed by distance. In the sonar room, the echo of the target fractured, scattered, reassembled like a thing deciding whether to live. "Hit," the operator breathed, then amended, "Maybe one, maybe glancing." Hastings saw it in the dota before he felt it in his bones. Whatever they had struck was still moving. Speed up a hair, depth 2 fathoms deeper, bow left half a degree. He could smell the insulation warming, taste the metallic phantom of his own fear. Over the next minutes, the target's course bent toward a canyon in the seafloor that the charts called ordinary, but every sailor respects as a cathedral of pressure. The captain understood the message. The I-boat, if that was what this was, intended to hide in shadow and rock and silence, trusting the sea to swallow all evidence of its passage. Far astern, Batfish was closing, having ridden the storm line like a horseman tracking sparks across a prairie. Her skipper, a lean man with the permanent squint of someone who had learned to read fate in chart lines, let the thunder of Seadragon's attack guide him. He throttled back, letting the ocean cool under his keel, then parked his boat on the expected exit lane of a wounded creature. He was betting his crew on a simple principle. When a giant bleeds, it seeks the same kind of safety as anything alive. Archerfish, further out, slid into a flanking position with the patience of an ambush spider, threading between thermal layers where sound bends like light, hiding in the physics of water. Above them all, the storm raged, but down here, it was a library where lives were written in margins. The counterpunch came without ceremony. A spray of pings peppered Seadragon's hull, high, stinging, the fingerprints of an escort that had found its nerve. Then the first pattern of depth charges fell. There is a particular prayer every submariner knows, and it has no words. It is a full-body question addressed to bolts and welds, and to the thick patience of steel. The charges walked across the water, each blossom of pressure slapping the boat's skin and pushing men into bulkheads like angry hands. Lights flickered, then steadied. The engineer, a calm soul who had once repaired a diesel with a kitchen spoon and an oath, eased the boat down a few more feet, feathered the trim, and made the boat smaller in the enemy's mind. Hastings held them there, not evading in panic, not running, but letting the escort spend its anger on ghosts and echoes. Minutes stretched. Another pattern fell, farther astern. Someone laughed once, one note, then swallowed it. When the ocean quieted, the contact they had wounded was gone, or pretending to be. Hastings chose to believe in presence. He set adrift, minimal sternway, bow, pointed where a clever captain might go if he knew death was feeling along the dark for his heartbeat. It was the exec who saw it first, not on a screen, but on the face of the sonar man. A tiny shift of breath, eyes tilted as if listening with bone rather than ear. "There," he whispered, and tapped the paper where he had been drawing a lover's line of range and bearing. The echo returned not as a single body, but as a shape with a wake inside it. A large thing carrying a smaller thing, or perhaps trailing something that did not belong to the sea. The room leaned closer as if attention could move a boat. Hastings knew the temptation to strike again immediately, to throw more iron into the water, and let probability sponsor courage, but patience wins wars and keeps men alive to remember that they were brave. He signaled a slow curving pursuit, a hunter's crescent, and asked Archerfish for nothing because silence was the only language permitted in Abyss. Yet, across that silence, a choreography unfolded. One submarine shadowing deep, one drifting high near a thermocline, one idling across an imaginary gate. None of them spoke to the others, but each felt the geometry the way a flock feels the sky. The second attack was cleaner. Batfish took it, raising her periscope for a blink so brief that a human blink was longer. Through the wet glass, the skipper saw nothing but a shiver of darker dark and the pale spine of foam from a destroyer miles off. He trusted the numbers, tubes ready, a breath, fire. The eels left the boat with a tenderness that belied their work. He turned hard, dove a whisper, and counted. 1 count, 2 count, 3 count, detonation. It came like a cathedral bell rung underwater, a sonorous blow that seemed to tilt the entire ocean. In its wake, the sonar room filled with confetti echoes, a snow of steel, a melody of things coming apart. then a second detonation deeper and more final, the signal of something large choosing heat and rupture over form. The men did not cheer. Submariners rarely do in the moment. They listened to the sea's new grammar and wrote down what they heard. The escort arrived late and furious, combing the water with lines of explosive punctuation. But Batfish had already slid into the folds of the thermocline, a fish becoming water, a rumor dissolving into temperature. Seadragon felt the tremors as stories, and Hastings allowed himself 1 second of belief that the ghost had been wounded badly or divided from something it carried. But within minutes, a second contact appeared, sister to the first, or perhaps the first itself refusing to stay dead. This one was faster, nervier, making odd zigzags that betrayed either damage or genius. Archerfish, patient as tide, took the trail and discovered the trick. The target was dumping canisters that sang like ships, decoys designed to clone the song of a screw and leading hunters into empty water. The ocean became a hall of mirrors. Hastings adjusted. He ordered short active pings, guilty little taps of sound that risked the boat's skin to peel away lies. The return sketched a crude portrait, a long hull with a humped back, a suggestion of an aircraft hangar where no submarine should have one, the outline of a conning tower taller than any known design. Men glanced at one another, at the short stack of rumors they had all heard but never spoken aloud. If the Imperial Navy truly had built underwater carriers, then the war contained chapters no one on their side had read yet. The chase stretched into day, masked as night. Down here, time loses its eyebrows and becomes smooth and untroubled. Men measure it in battery draw and the sweet stink of exhausted air. The cook passed coffee like a priest passes comfort, and the yeoman sharpened pencils as if a point could hold back fate. The rudder sang lightly as Seadragon carved long arcs, keeping respectful distance while Archerfish nudged closer to truth. At last, a luck not earned but accepted. The target rose a few feet, perhaps to check bearings or clear lungs, and the surface whispered its presence with a ribbon of bubbles that the periscope kissed. Hastings did not see a ship. He saw an absence where starlight should have been, and knew it for a hull. He did the math in a breath and realized that if he moved now, he could write an ending instead of an ellipsis. He ordered a slow rise, not enough to break stealth, just enough to shorten fate's stride. The exec laid the firing solution with a reverence that belongs in churches. Tubes 1 and 2, stand by. The ocean listened. Fire. The word left Hastings like a coin tossed into a well. 2 torpedoes leapt. He turned 3 degrees, a polite refusal to be where an angry thought might land, and steadied. The count began again. The old dance. This time the answer came not as a single blow, but as a sequence, a drumbeat stepping down a spine. First impact, a hollow thud like the knock of a giant at a locked door. Second, a crack that threw glittering nails through the water. Third, a deep stomach sound, the kind that speaks of compartments making terrible decisions under pressure. The target lurched. Sonar reported a change in song, screws spinning faster, then juddering. Hastings pictured men on the other boat running hands along pipes hot enough to peel skin, shouting in a language he did not know about valves and mercy. He ordered no gloat, no rise to look at the wound. Instead, he told the helmsman to match course, a respectful distance astern, as if escorting a wounded enemy to its fate. The escort's return came like weather. Depth charges stitched the water, with violent grammar, commas of concussion that tried to force Seadragon into a sentence ending in period. The engineer bled speed, shaved depth, and made ballast sing in tiny adjustments. Pipes clattered, a gauge stuttered, then recovered. Somewhere a light died with a pop and the smell of burned dust. Men rode it with the professionalism of those who have learned to be furniture during earthquakes. The charges moved away. Silence swelled. In that space, sonar spoke a coda. The big contact was sinking, not fast, not explosively, but with the stubborn grace of a stadium leaving its seats after a game. Then, at last, a final groan came through the hull, and the sea flattened its hands over the place where a secret had tried to live. Hastings did not surface. He did not send a message. Operation Abyss permitted neither triumph nor confession. He wrote a line in a log that would later be erased, and asked his crew for quiet inspection of every valve, every bearing, every habit that had kept them alive. Far off on the flank, Archerfish reported nothing to no one, and ran her hand along the seam between myth and wreckage. Batfish drifted under the thermocline, listening to the wreck fall apart into a kind of snow. Together and alone, the three boats completed the figure they had drawn across the night, a hunter's triangle enclosing a story the world was not yet allowed to hear. In the mess, men ate in the calm that follows thunder. The cook served eggs that tasted like victory and fear. The exec sharpened another pencil he did not need. Hastings stood with his hand on the chart table, feeling the boat's heartbeat match his own, and thought, if that was only one, how many more are there? And what were they carrying that someone would hide them beneath an ocean and bury the truth in silence? He let the question settle like silt and gave the order to resume patrol. The hunt was not over. It had only taught them the shape of the dark. The ghost fleet. For days they prowled through the void left behind by what they believed was a single dying Leviathan. But the Pacific has a way of pretending to be empty just before it reveals that it is crowded with ghosts. The reports from Batfish and Archerfish were never spoken aloud, only written in the kind of terse language that hides emotion inside precision. New contacts, multiple, widely spaced, all moving east at slow speed, all too deep to be ordinary ships. Hastings studied the positions and felt the back of his neck tighten. These were not random survivors. They were formation. They were fleet. Somewhere, someone had taught these monsters to move as one. The charts called this patch of water the Devil's Corridor, a trench 5 miles deep, flanked by mountains that rise like teeth. The Americans had avoided it for most of the war because sound behaves badly there. It bends and folds and lies. But now, the sea itself was drawing them in. Operation Abyss became a web of lines drawn across a map that no longer felt theoretical. The plan was crude and brilliant. Seadragon would shadow from the south, Batfish would hold station to the west, and Archerfish would slip ahead to catch the fleet in profile. They would not attack until they knew how many there were, and what they were protecting. The weather on the surface was unspeakable. Typhoon season, gray sheets of rain cutting the sea to ribbons. But below it was a cathedral of stillness. The crew stopped joking. They spoke in notes instead of words, the way men do when they suspect that the air itself is listening. The sonar operators described what they heard in the language of superstition. One contact that sounded like it had 2 hearts, another that sang in a perfect rhythm of 7 beats, and one that vanished every time they blinked. The captain of Archerfish, Commander Joseph Enright, believed they were chasing a convoy of supply subs headed for the home islands, but as the days passed and more shapes appeared, that theory fell apart. No known navy moved its submarines in herds. It was madness and genius combined, the kind of idea born from desperation. The Japanese Empire was starving, its fuel reserves nearly gone. The logical conclusion was that these giant I-boats were carrying the Empire's last hope: uranium ore, weapon plans, diplomats trying to negotiate survival. In Washington, codebreakers in Station Hypo pieced together transmissions intercepted from Tokyo that confirmed something extraordinary. A flotilla-designated Special Submarine Group 7, commanded by an admiral whose name appeared nowhere in official rosters, was attempting to reach Singapore. The cargo manifests were blank, the orders sealed, and every message carried the same phrase at the end: Kaj no Aikari, the Shadow's Wrath. The analysts could not decide if it was a code name or a prayer. Lockwood, reading the reports, felt the same chill he had felt when Midway hung in the balance. He sent a message that would never enter the archives. Proceed. All discretion. End this. The first glimpse came to Archerfish on the night of October 28, 1944. Through a periscope dripping with condensation, Enright saw a massive dark shape cutting across the starlit sea. So large he thought for an instant it was a cruiser. Then he saw the curved back, the conning tower rising like a watchtower, and the glint of water streaming off an aircraft hangar door. He whispered, "Good Lord, that's a submarine." The target was I-401, the flagship of the Ghost Fleet, one of the largest submarines ever built, an underwater aircraft carrier carrying 3 Saran bombers meant to strike the Panama Canal. But Enright did not know that then. He knew only that it was enormous, and that his torpedoes were already armed. He fired 6. The explosions came one after another, shaking the deep with the rhythm of a heartbeat finally forced to stop. Flames boiled to the surface, brief as breath. When the smoke cleared, the sea was smooth again. For a moment, the men believed it was over. Then sonar reported more screws, dozens. The Ghost Fleet was real, and now it was scattering. Batfish engaged a second target 2 nights later, sinking it after a long pursuit that left both crews half-mad from exhaustion. Seadragon followed faint echoes eastward and found something she could not explain, a formation of subs escorting a vessel twice their size, a moving island under the water. The sound was so massive it distorted the instruments. Hastings watched the lines on the oscilloscope blur into one continuous hum, the signature of something too big to exist. He considered attacking, but instinct whispered that what they were hearing was not just another submarine. It might have been a depot, or a mobile base, or a machine built to carry the remnants of a nation across the ocean. He logged the contact as unknown Leviathan, no attack. Then, on the morning of November 3rd, Batfish picked up a mayday in clear tone, a Japanese voice repeating coordinates and the phrase UREI, ghost unit. The voice cut off mid-word. The message was traced to the coordinates where Seadragon had last reported contact. Hastings ordered a turn toward the source, against every rule of stealth, and what they found was a field of debris rising like snow through the beam of the searchlight. Wooden crates, oil drums, papers sealed in wax, and bodies, dozens of them, floating upright as if marching through the dark. One corpse wore an officer's cap. In his pocket was a small metal box engraved with a symbol none of them recognized, a sun eclipsed by a crescent. The men said nothing. Hastings ordered the box locked in the safe. He did not write it in the log. By the end of that week, the ocean was empty again. The ghost fleet had vanished as if the sea had inhaled it. Batfish and Archerfish returned to Pearl with half their torpedoes gone and their nerves shredded. Seadragon stayed out, patrolling a grid no one had assigned her, unwilling to leave the riddle unsolved. On the 15th day, she picked up a final signal, a pulse that matched the heartbeat from the first night of Operation Abyss. It was weaker now, further south, drifting into the trenches. Hastings stared at the glowing green line on the scope and understood that he was listening to the last breath of the thing they had been chasing. He did not pursue. He shut off the sonar and sat in silence, surrounded by men who were suddenly aware that they might have destroyed something so secret that even their own admirals were afraid to name it. When Seadragon finally returned to Pearl, the crew was met by officers who took their logs, their film, and their memories. They were told that Operation Abyss had never existed. The patrol would be recorded as routine. Every man aboard signed papers promising silence. And for the rest of their lives, when they dreamed, they would hear that sound again, the pulse of something vast dying quietly beneath the sea. The erasure. When the war finally ended in the summer of 1945, the men of Operation Abyss returned to a nation celebrating victory, yet they carried no medals, no parades, and no official mention of what they had done. The records of their patrols were sealed in gray folders stamped with a code number no historian would ever see. Seadragon was reassigned to training duty, her hull scrubbed clean of scars, her logs rewritten to show a simple patrol through calm waters. Hastings was called to Washington, where he sat in a windowless office for 8 hours, while 2 officers from Naval Intelligence asked him the same questions in different orders. How many targets had he engaged? What proof did he have? Who had he told? At the end of the interrogation, they slid a single sheet across the table and told him to sign. The paper stated that nothing beyond standard operations had occurred, that all actions taken were within routine anti-shipping missions, and that any mention of a fleet or unidentified contacts had been misinterpretations caused by weather anomalies and sonar malfunction. Hastings read it twice, then signed. He left the building into humid Washington air that smelled of celebration and gasoline and realized that a piece of his life had been quietly deleted. He was not the only one. Commander Enright of Archerfish found that his report on the sinking of the giant submarine had been heavily edited, the details replaced by vague language about a large enemy vessel. Batfish's skipper received a commendation for tonnage sunk, but the citations named merchant ships that had never existed. Even Admiral Lockwood, who had authorized the mission, was reassigned to a committee on post-war naval reorganization and told that the files concerning Operation Abyss were under review by higher authority. When he asked who that authority was, the answer came back in the kind of silence that outranks admirals. Months later, fragments of the truth began to surface. Japanese surrender documents mentioned the I-401, the I-402, and a handful of sister boats that had disappeared without trace while attempting to reach Singapore. The Imperial Navy had indeed planned a last desperate operation, an attack on the Panama Canal using submarine-launched aircraft, but half the flotilla had never arrived. The remaining vessels were found scuttled in shallow water near Kuri, their crews dead by their own hands. Among the recovered papers were references to an additional vessel, designated simply as I-0, commanded directly by the Naval General Staff and ordered to carry national materials to an undisclosed location. The Japanese officers who survived refused to elaborate, insisting that the ship had been destroyed long before surrender. No one in Allied command could confirm its existence. Lockwood read those documents with a sense of recognition he could not admit aloud. The phantom contact Hastings had reported in his last message, the one too large to classify, fit the description perfectly. Yet with the war over and the world rearranging itself into peace, there was no appetite for new mysteries. The files were boxed, stamped secret, and placed in a warehouse that leaked dust and bureaucratic forgetfulness. For Hastings, peace felt stranger than war. He retired in 1947 and took a job teaching navigation at a maritime academy. His lectures were precise, calm, devoid of ghosts. Only once, during a storm that reminded him of the Devil's Corridor, did he tell a student that the sea sometimes remembers what men try to forget. The student laughed, thinking it a sailor's superstition, and Hastings did not correct him. Batfish was scrapped. Archerfish reassigned to trials that tested new sonar systems built from technology recovered from Japanese wrecks. The engineers who designed those systems never knew that the data came from a mission that never officially happened. In 1953, a classified memo crossed the desk of a young intelligence officer working on Cold War submarine acoustics. It described an anomalous sonar recording captured by an American destroyer near Guam. Deep, rhythmic pulses identical to the heartbeat signature logged by Seadragon a decade earlier. The report concluded that it was probably geological. The officer filed it away and forgot it. By the time 2 decades had passed, the ocean had reclaimed its silence. The veterans of the silent service gathered for reunions, telling stories of torpedoes, storms, and near-death escapes, but never of Operation Abyss. When someone asked Hastings what it had been like to hunt the I-boats, he smiled and said, "Like chasing thunder." That was all. The truth had become too heavy to lift. Yet in 1968, a Japanese fishing trawler caught its nets on something massive in the deep trench east of the Marianas. When they hauled up a fragment, it was a piece of curved steel painted with faded characters and the same symbol Hastings had seen on that small metal box, the sun eclipsed by a crescent. The Japanese authorities took possession of it immediately, declaring it an old cargo hull. The fishermen were paid to forget. But the ocean, it seems, does not forget. Decades later, when the Cold War turned the seas into new hunting grounds, a U.S. nuclear submarine passed through the same coordinates. The sonar officer, a young man who had never heard of Seadragon or Operation Abyss, recorded a deep mechanical pulse unlike anything in the database. It repeated twice and then was gone. The entry in the log was routine, possible biological, but the recording was archived. Years afterward, when those tapes were digitized, a historian cross-referenced the waveform with declassified World War II sonar patterns and found a perfect match. The last living member of Seadragon's crew was interviewed. When he heard the playback, his face went pale. "That's it," he whispered. "That's the sound." The interviewer asked what it meant. The old sailor looked at the floor and said, "It means it's still down there. Time has a way of sanding the sharp edges off history, of turning terror into trivia, of rewriting wars into neat paragraphs that fit between advertisements. But the ocean remembers in frequencies, not words. It keeps every whisper ever made beneath its surface, every explosion, every dying engine, every heartbeat that once belonged to a machine pretending to be alive." When the last files of Operation Abyss were finally declassified in the late 1990s, the pages were thin, faded, and full of absences. Names were redacted, coordinates were missing. Even the signatures had been trimmed away by scissors decades earlier. The reports described standard patrols, no anomalies, no extraordinary encounters. Yet tucked between the paperwork was a single sheet of graph paper marked in pencil, a series of peaks and valleys labeled Unidentified Pulse. In the margin, someone had written 3 words, still transmitting faintly. No one in the review committee knew what it meant. The graph was scanned, stored, and forgotten again. But for those who had lived it, the echoes never left. Admiral Lockwood died believing he had glimpsed a chapter of warfare that no one else would ever acknowledge. Commander Hastings, in his final years, would sit by the sea with a shortwave radio pressed to his ear, tuning through static as if searching for a heartbeat lost in the static of time. Neighbors said they sometimes heard him speak softly to the ocean, asking if it was finished yet, as though the water could answer. In 1974, a Japanese research submersible conducting geological surveys near the Caroline Islands recorded something that startled its crew. The instruments captured a slow, rhythmic throb emanating from below 5,000 meters, too deep for any known vessel. The signal was steady, metallic, and distinctly artificial. The scientists labeled it an equipment malfunction. But one of them, an older engineer who had served in the Imperial Navy, recognized the pattern. He did not tell his colleagues. When he returned to Tokyo, he visited the Naval Museum and left an unsigned letter on the desk of the curator. It contained only one line: "The ghosts of the abyss still move." Through the closing years of the 20th century, oceanographers continued to pick up unexplained low-frequency sounds across the Pacific. The press called them the bloop, Julia, upsweep, giving each a name to make them less frightening. But a handful of analysts inside naval archives compared those signals to wartime acoustic profiles and discovered that several shared striking similarities with the I-class submarines logged during the 1940s. The finding was quietly suppressed. The Navy had no desire to entertain the idea that something human-made, long thought destroyed, might still be operating in the trenches. Instead, the reports were marked as natural phenomena: ice fractures, tectonic shifts, or whales no one had ever seen. And yet, in 1998, a sonar buoy stationed near Guam recorded a pattern that could not be dismissed. The rhythm was identical to the one Hastings had heard more than 50 years earlier. The same measured pulse, the same fading tempo, as if the ocean itself were playing back a memory. When analysts traced its source, the coordinates pointed directly to the heart of the Devil's Corridor. The recording was archived under a new classification, its metadata encrypted, and to this day, the file remains sealed. Officially, it is geological noise. Unofficially, those who have listened to it swear they can hear machinery breathing. History will tell you that wars end when treaties are signed, when ships are scrapped, when men go home. But those who served in the silent service understood a different truth: that some wars go on in silence, buried under miles of water, replaying themselves in the dark. The hunters of Operation Abyss were never recognized, their mission never written into textbooks, yet the shape of their story remains carved into the frequencies of the Pacific. The sea does not forget, and neither does the steel that sleeps within it. Perhaps somewhere down there, in the black between trenches, a hull still moves slowly through silt, carrying secrets that were meant to die and never quite did. And if you stand on a quiet shore on a windless night when the tide is low and the world holds its breath, you might feel a faint vibration under your feet, a pulse older than memory, steady as the human heart. That is not the tide. That is the echo of a war that never officially happened. The debrief, the last transmission. Decades after the last echoes of the war faded, the story of Operation Abyss might have remained a rumor, whispered among old sailors, if not for a single discovery that forced history to listen again. In 2021, a joint American and Japanese deep-sea research team launched an expedition to map the trenches east of the Marianas using autonomous drones equipped with next-generation sonar. Officially, the mission was geological, an effort to study seismic activity, but among the crew were two naval historians who had read fragments of the declassified Abyss files. They were curious about one set of coordinates that appeared repeatedly in the surviving patrol logs, a point in the trench marked simply with the word Leviathan. For 6 days, the drones swept the region, sending back endless grids of rock and silt. On the 7th day, one of them returned a series of readings that made no sense. The data showed smooth metal contours buried beneath 6,000 meters of sediment, arranged in a shape far too regular to be natural. The outline matched almost exactly the known dimensions of an I-class submarine, but twice the size. The researchers at first thought it must be a geological anomaly, yet the metallic density readings told another story. The hull, if it was a hull, measured over 400 meters long, larger than any submarine ever built by any nation. When they replayed the sonar feed, the signal returned not as static, but as a slow pulse, one deep tone every 30 seconds, faint but mechanical. The crew stared at the waveform, uncertain whether they were listening to an echo of their own instruments or to something that still lived in the dark. Word of the finding spread quietly through naval circles, stirring memories that had long been buried. Within months, the expedition's files were classified, and the official statement released to the press mentioned only USS, a metallic anomaly of unknown origin. But not everyone accepted that explanation. The lead sonar engineer, a woman named Dr. Naomi Sato, leaked a single frame of the acoustic map to a journalist who had written about post-war cover-ups. The image showed a long, slender shape resting at an angle on the seafloor, a raised tower at the midpoint, and the faint suggestion of hangar doors along its spine. Beneath it, the words signal source, confirmed rhythmic output were highlighted. The journalist published a small article online titled, "The Ghost Fleet Still Sleeps." It went unnoticed for months until a former naval intelligence officer recognized the coordinates and contacted him. That man had been part of the archival team that digitized the old Operation Abyss records. He confirmed that the pattern in the sonar matched exactly the pulse recorded by Seadragon in 1944. The revelation reignited interest in the mission that had officially never existed. A documentary team petitioned for access to the classified material and was denied. Yet interviews began appearing with the descendants of the crewmen. One grandson recalled his grandfather waking in the night, shouting about a heartbeat in the deep. Another family shared a sealed letter written in 1946 that read, "If they ever find it, tell them to leave it alone." For the first time since the war, the silence around Operation Abyss began to crack. Historians argued over what the Americans had actually encountered. Some believed the I-boats had been carrying experimental reactors or long-range communications devices. Others speculated that the heartbeat was a sonar beacon designed to mask movements of remaining Japanese subs. But a few, including Dr. Sato, proposed something stranger, that the massive structure might have been a prototype for a self-sustaining undersea base, a vessel intended to survive indefinitely, powered by mechanisms no one now understood. When news of the discovery reached the United States Navy, a small conference was convened at Pearl Harbor, the same base where Operation Abyss had begun nearly 80 years earlier. In a briefing room lined with photographs of the old fleet, a historian presented the evidence to a handful of officers. The final slide showed the waveform captured by the modern expedition. When played through speakers, the room filled with that same low, steady pulse. It was slower now, almost tired, but unmistakably artificial. One admiral asked whether it could simply be an echo bouncing through the trench. The historian paused, then replied, "It's repeating at a constant interval. Echoes don't keep time." The silence that followed was long enough to feel like an answer. After the meeting, the recording was locked under a new classification, and all further research in that sector of the Pacific was quietly suspended. The official reason was budgetary. Unofficially, it was caution. A memo circulated internally, warning that unauthorized interference with wartime wreckage could pose environmental and strategic hazards. When a journalist filed a Freedom of Information request, the response came back redacted almost entirely, leaving only a single sentence visible. Certain operations remain sensitive due to ongoing acoustic anomalies. And so the circle closed. The war that never officially happened had found a way to whisper again from its own grave. The few who have heard the modern recordings describe them the same way Hastings once did. Not like an engine, not like a whale, but like a heartbeat measured by a patient that refuses to die. The purpose of this final act, this debrief, is not to claim that the Ghost Fleet still moves beneath the waves, but to explain why this story resurfaced now. Because history, like the ocean, eventually returns everything it swallows. Every document, every sound. Operation Abyss was never meant to be remembered, yet here it is, reaching across decades, across silence, demanding to be heard. If the expedition's readings are ever confirmed, they will not just rewrite naval history. They will prove that somewhere in the darkness, the remnants of an empire are still dreaming, their machines still ticking away the seconds of a war the world decided to forget. And perhaps that is the truest lesson of all, that the past does not stay buried, that secrets have their own days, and that some echoes are not meant to fade. If you ever hear that faint, rhythmic pulse while listening to recordings of the deep, do not assume it is noise. It may be the last transmission of a story that was erased, the heartbeat of the operation that never officially happened.